Hey guys, I'm Nick and today we are creating this amazing and full of cool stuff RBD disintegration thing. And originally I saw that from this project, which is done by Florian Baumann, Linus Schneider, Roman Keln, and Echoic Audio for sound design. And you can basically see this frame here, and that is what we will be aiming for. Of course, I think this was done in a sort of a professional team, and they obviously composited it better than me because I was exporting the PNGs as always. But what I want to show you here is that we can kind of trick a few shots here, a few setups here, and yeah, it will be looking great. The main thing here was the smoke sim, which should be pretty detailed for this effect. And as you may already know, I don't do really actually like hundreds of gigabytes of simulations, but yeah, still I think it's pretty good. The overall cache size is around like 90 gigabytes or 60 gigabytes, so it's not that bad. And also here you probably can see that we have separated our smoke, our dust particles, like a bigger dust particles, the particles that grow over time and make it kind of like disintegrate, the actual RBD sim, and of course our backplate. But yeah, for the lights and textures, we will also talk about it a bit later. There are two cameras, two shots in this animation, and yeah, just one light, RS light dome with some sort of a photo studio HDRI that I grabbed from HDRI Heaven. Alright, so I think let's start like setup by setup. I think we can enable our RBD setup here, and yeah, this watch was, I think it was from the Sketchfab. I will link that in the description. And yeah, and I deleted a bunch of stuff from it and modified it a bit in Cinema 4D. So yeah, if we drop the watch alembic and then convert it back to polygons and then apply the transform, because the scale is obviously super big, and that's the thing that you should basically modify in Cinema 4D when exporting. For me, it's not a big deal to just drop a transform here and scale it down a lot. But yeah, here you can see I also used the new remesher thing in Cinema 4D. It's basically a combination of like VDB and that remesher, and hands down, when maxed on both the ZBrush, yeah, the new remesher is amazing. Alright, so yeah, for this one we don't have, oh okay, actually we have normals, but yeah, anyhow, we don't need it exactly here. And you will see that this setup changes a bit through time, because when I'm going over it multiple times, I might understand that something is not used anymore because I was experimenting with the different stuff here. And yeah, just be sure to follow. I will cover all the nodes that are actually used and are actually necessary to recreate the setup. So yeah, here's our null after our import. So it's out, not the torus anymore, it's out watch. So yeah, then we basically start our RBD journey and drop the RBD material fracture. For this fracture, I'm using material type set to concrete, and let it just yeah, calculate everything, and we have these two levels of fracture. First level set to 15, scatter points 15. Scatter seed, yeah, you can just leave it at 0. Be sure to play with this alligator, in my case it's alligator noise, but you can play with all of these noises, because you know the default concrete scatter point scatter, like not the point scatter, but default point scatter for the concrete RBD material fracture, it's you know, it's pretty used if you can say it like that. So my advice would be really play with these settings, as you can see here in that fog volume. And for the second one, second level of fracture, I'm actually scattering 40 points, and also did a few changes here in the fog volume. I won't be saying here exact numbers because it doesn't influence that much. It's just like tweaking these numbers until you like the look, and you can always visualize the look just like dropping this exploded view node here. And yeah, let's get this here and zoom out a little bit. And yeah, I pretty much like this, these fractures, these tiny bits here. So I would say, yeah, that's it with the RBD material fracture. Of course, for the constraints, search radius, so default, but just uncheck this apply constraint properties because we don't actually need any sort of glue constraints, all that stuff. We don't need that. And after that, before we actually, or actually, yeah, let's get to the RBD. Let's just get it done, and then we will talk about the activation and all this stuff. So after the RBD material fracture, we drop an RBD configure. And RBD configure basically just packs it all up, and it's ready for the RBD build solver. Super important thing is to add the auto UVs or UV project, UV and wrap, something that will create our UVs, to add that before RBD build solver. For the solver here, what we will be doing is increasing the subsets to 30, bullet object, collision padding 0.01, collisions, again collision padding 0.01, and in the forces disable the gravity. In the advanced tab, and that's super important, we want to decrease this sleeping time to 0, because if you don't do that, your RBD chunks will just stop at the random positions and a bit like random time depending on what it is here in the sleeping time. But basically, if you want your RBD simulation to run indefinitely, you want to set this sleeping time to be 0. And now we can go into our RBD bullet solver. Let's maybe reset this, and yeah, let me just resave this project as RBD disintegration tutorial, because we will be doing a few like manipulations here, and I just want to be sure that everything is in place. We don't mess with something. Let me just remove these two, or actually like bypass them, and show you what it is right now. So you can see that we have our UVs, and if I play this simulation, nothing happens because we don't have gravity, we don't have any forces, we don't have anything. Now, if I enable pop wind, you probably will see that it all just goes nuts, and yeah, just flies away. And we don't like that. We want to create some attribute that will tell Houdini which RBD fracture pieces should receive any force, or should actually like react to the forces, because right now they all are reacting to this pop wind, to the actual wind force. And here is our block of creating that attribute. So after our RBD material fracture, we drop an assemble because we want to pass that attribute to each of the chunks, because in RBD we are working with the packed geometry. So we drop this assemble and we check the create packed primitives here. After that, we delete all the primitives because we don't need like actual primitives, because these primitives, when they are packed, they actually get all their attributes from the points that are, in this case, that are in the centroid of the packed primitive. So we can actually use our well-known attribute transfer here. And if we paint all the points into black, and then we add our kind of like a sphere, and then we paint it in the red color, and then we have our attribute transfer. We can animate the distance, and in the attributes here you can see that I'm transferring color data from the points on these two geometries, from the sphere to our assembled RBD setup. In the attribute transfer, I animate this distance threshold from frame 1 to frame 90, and yeah, for the sake of this animation, we are doing all simulations only for the 90 frames, and then we will be retiming it, decreasing the speed of the animation and all of the simulations obviously by 3 times. So we are getting like 280, 270 actually frames. So yeah, here you can see I've just keyframed it from 0.05 to something around 1.3. Source group type set to points. And yeah, and then we drop this attribute wrangle where we create the float attribute, which is in my case called active PT, which is active points, and it is equal to the red channel. So it will be equal to something from 0 to 1, because where it's black, it's obviously the red channel is 0, and when it's red, the red channel is 1. So there is no sort of a blending right now. It's just like enabling that that thing, that color, you know, because again we are transferring that to points. You cannot kind of paint the point. There is no such ramp in this setup. But then when we have our attribute wrangle where we promote the red channel to the active PT attribute, then in the RBD bullet solver we can also drop geometry wrangle, and for this one we go into the inputs. Yeah, we don't need this one, but here for the first input we change it to be SOP, and SOP pass will be our attribute wrangle where we specify that red channel now is bind to the active PT attribute. And here this attribute active, it's actually like a proprietary Houdini attribute, and it tells whether the points are active, points reactive forces. And if I set it here to be 0 and just comment this line, you can see that we still have our win, but if we play, nothing actually happens because we have set this active to be 0. And yeah, basically now we just grab the active PT from our point, from our 0 input, and input 0 is this input 1. Yeah, we grab this attribute here, convert it to integer because I've set it to be float, and you will have warning if you assign the float to integer, because the active attribute is actually integer and it wants integer values. So yeah, now you can see that our disintegration happens smoothly and only in those parts that are red. Then I file cached it all, and yeah, probably let's just play it. So here you can see our simulation, our 90 frames. Then for now we are bypassing this retime, and you'd also, when you will be rebuilding this setup and if you start with the RBD, don't use this retime. You can drop it, configure it all here. Be sure that you are not using your UV attributes here, so this kind of like shift 6 UV, which excludes UV from the list of attributes that will be interpolated. So yeah, for now just leave it there. Then we will need this kind of raw input from our file cache, so I drop this out RBD null. And then we want to do a few coloring things, because when we will be rendering, we will be referencing the colors to drive our opacity of kind of different chunks. It applies both to RBD particles, dust particles, all that stuff. So now we unpack it and we see our geometry here. Then we want to select, then we want to measure the distance, the actual distance that our chunks travel from their kind of initial position to the position on each frame. And as that distance getting bigger, we will be decreasing the opacity of these chunks. So here in the unpack node, after that unpack node, I drop a time shift, set it to be the frame 1. So whatever frame we select, it always will be this frame 1 because we dropped a time shift. And here after that time shift, I drop an attribute wrangle and I create this vector attribute, which is called in my case init pos, like initial position, and it is equal to that position and the frame 1. After that, I dropped another attribute wrangle, and then I kind of read it in the variable, in the local variable of that attribute wrangle. So I create vector init pos, and that's not an attribute, that's not stored in the geometry spreadsheet, it's just like in that wrangle. So yeah, this init pos is that global init pos from that first input. And then I create the float dist attribute, which is a result of the function distance, which measures the distance between 2 points, and one of that is actual position that is right now with that chunk, like here at the frame 90 or at the frame, I don't know, maybe 30. Yeah, you can see that basically, for example, this chunk is already disconnected and it already has some distance that is not 0 because it changed its initial position. And here you can see that I'm adding that that position that is right now, and the frame for now is 42. And yeah, and the second input is our initial position, which was at the frame 1. Then I drop the color, and I set it to be RAM from attribute. Attribute should be set to our dist. And here you can see that when these chunks go away from their initial distance, they are getting darker and darker. And basically when they are like black, they will be absolutely transparent and they won't be actually visible. So that's how you can hide the geometry, like dissolve the geometry. You can basically see it's not that visible for now, but when we will be rendering that, you will actually see that. And here is how you basically can dissolve any sort of geometry. Then this attribute triangle, for now we are also bypassing that. Let me just tell you that it's the velocity scaling, and this velocity scaling is for this retime node, and we will come back to that just a bit later. And then yeah, null out opacity. So that's your RBD simulation here. So all right, this RBD, just like alone, it will be super boring, and that's why I think we like the first thing that comes to my mind, it will be adding some dust particles. And these dust particles are actually like debris that are from our RBD simulation. And yeah, let me just again remove this retime for now. We have our file cache, and here's our debris. We drop the object merge and we grab our out RBD, which is kind of like our raw input after our file cache. Then we drop this debris source, and yeah, this debris source basically does everything. So yeah, you can see it spawns particles on the surface of the chunks that have certain velocity or have traveled certain distance from their initial position. And it's here actually the distance threshold, and you can like select it to be for example 0, 1 for example, and then you can see that they will appear on chunks that traveled much more distance when it's, for example, compared to the 0.01, and you can maybe experiment and set it to be 0.001. Yeah, so it's up to you actually. So yeah, I will leave it at 0.01. And yeah, we have our attribute wrangle just to set the P scale, and then we drop the popnet. In the popnet, it's all default. Yeah, it's all default. Emission type set to all points. Geometry source use first context geometry. And yeah, I just added just a bit of pop wind with a turbulence. So yeah, looks like this. And here is also one important thing, that we have this. You can see here in the debris source, we have this lifespan, right? And also we want to check the point number attribute. But basically, we have this age attribute and lifespan, and we can bind our color data to that lifespan. So it's same thing that we did with the RBD chunks, that they, after a certain distance, they disappear. This here should also disappear after a certain time. And for example, I can move this slider, and you can see that basically on the black background it's very realistic looking, like in the render, because you also won't see these parts that are black, because we will be binding the color data to the opacity, and black opacity means 0, and 0 means absolutely transparent geometry that is not being rendered anyhow. So yeah, I will leave it at here. I don't want like really contrasty look there where these particles just boom and they disappear at certain frame. I want them to gradually like become more and more transparent. This retime node here is also not needed for now. We will talk about it later. And this velocity scaling is also not needed for now. Now let's talk about the smoke simulation. So for our smoke, I'm dropping this object merge again here, and I'm getting my out opacity here. We want to delete everything that is kind of in the middle. We want to select concrete fracture inside and fracture outside, fracture 1, okay, of course, and delete non-selected. So if I drag it to the frame 30, you can see that these pieces now are hollow. And now we drop a group. Here I set the group to target every point that has the distance more than 0.01. Which is kind of the same thing that we did for our debris particles. We want to select the geometry that will be emitting the smoke to have the distance between the initial position and the current position at least 0.01, and then it will be emitting that smoke. So here you can see, as I will be scrubbing the timeline, you can see that as they are getting away from their initial position, we are adding them to that group. And after that group, we drop another group, and here's the trick. So of course group types should be set to points, but initial merge for the group 4 should be intersect with existing. And I kind of eyeballed that after the distance exceeds 0.3, I don't want these to emit smoke because they won't be even visible. And if I, let's say, scrub to the frame 60 and enable this group 4, you can see that we are not targeting these things here anymore, these chunks here. And yeah, obviously we want to delete them. So then we delete this group 3, delete non-selected. We delete everything that is not in that group. And we have our small chunks that will emit the smoke till the frame 90, of course. So then we drop the pyro source, and here particle separation is set to 0.003, which is pretty low. In order for you to get these density and temperature attributes, you wanna select here initialize and source smoke. Mode should be set to surface scatter, and yeah, that's all what you need to do. I strongly suggest you trying for the first time, checking the particle separation to be like 0.1, 0.05, something like that, because 0.03 will take a lot of time to simulate that. For the attribute noise float, this is where I want to change the density to introduce a bit more variation to our chunks, because let me just play to the frame, I don't know, and yeah, of course we want to select the pyro source to be 1 for now, just for now. Yeah, let's play it. We will see our chunks appear. Yeah, here they are. And attribute noise float will introduce a bit more variation in the density, and when we manipulate the density, we will get just a bit more interesting result in our smoke simulation. The attribute noise float, attribute names, density, Perlin flow noise, element size 0.3. We can drop a color, RAM from attributes, density range 1.1, 1.8. That's what you can see here in the geometry spreadsheet. We can go here. Of course, it changes, but yeah. For now, it will be like this, and we can visualize it. You can see here's our density visualized. Then our volume rasterize attributes, and of course our pyro solver. The thing here with the volume rasterize attributes, we want to rasterize density, temperature, and velocity. For the voxel size, I just went here in the pyro source particle separation copy parameter. Here in volume rasterize attributes, I go and select paste relative references, so it references this particle separation from the pyro source. Same thing for the pyro solver. For the voxel size, paste relative references, it gets the value of the voxel size from our particle separation. For the pyro solver, max substeps 3, global substeps 1. Maybe you want to go with global substeps set to 2. Cache memory, in my case, I don't know, it's maybe that's because I'm on the Mac, but I need to increase that to be like 9,000 megabytes. For the sourcing, limit source range should be unchecked. This all is default. Collisions should be set to, I don't think that I have actually like changed something. For the fields, dissipation set to 0.01, so it doesn't dissipate that quickly. For the shape, I uncheck the buoyancy in wind and just add disturbance and turbulence. For the look, yeah, just check the smoke here. For the export, I think it's all default here. And yeah, we can cache it out, of course. Let me just select this to be 0.05 0.04 as it was. I think it was 0.04. And yeah, here in the file cache, I have simulated 90 frames of that. It's hard to see right now, but yeah, it will be beautiful once rendered. And after you have file cached it, now it's time to talk about this retime node here. So the thing is, if we retime our RBD simulation before we do the smoke simulation, our smoke won't have that expressive velocity that I really want to see. I want to see these smoke trails from the RBD chunks that are blown away with that wind force. And the thing is, we want to simulate the smoke, these 90 frames, without retime being applied to the RBD simulation. And once we have file cached our smoke, we can go back here in RBD, enable the retime node, and because I also want to see really drastic motion blur, and if we retime that to be 3 times less speed than it should be, we also won't get that motion blur. And I was just like bumping the limits on the redshift, and that's why we drop this attribute wrangle here, just like before the out opacity. We drop that velocity scaling wrangle, and we scale every part of the velocity vector, we scale it by 10. That will allow us to actually get the right motion blur. So we enable that here, and then we also go into our dust particles. We enable the retime after our file cache. That same retime that was in that RBD, just make sure that here you remember that in the resource we enable the point num attribute, and in the retime point ID attribute should be that point num, because it won't have any IDs for the points. And of course we need to drop that attribute wrangle where we scale our velocities again. So for the smoke now, we also add the retime, and you cannot retime it with these attributes like we do for the mesh simulations, like the RBDs and particles. You want to go to these volumes, and this is a trick that I learned from the John Kunz, and probably you already watched his lives, and they are incredibly long, but also packed with cool stuff. So here, respect to John Kunz. And yeah, the blend mode should be set to advected, and advection step size in my case is 0.01. It takes time now to calculate actually each frame. You can see it here, but yeah, in the end we have this retime working for each of our layers in this setup. I dropped the material here, but I don't think that we actually need it here because we set it here in the render. Now we basically have everything that we ever needed, right? So out opacity here, the dust should be set here, and the smoke simulation. So yeah, basically everything is there. We can scrub to the frame 150 and we should see a bit of smoke, a bit of everything, you know. So this should look good as it is right now, yeah, but I wanted something that will kind of initiate or the start of these chunks like being separated and flying away. So I want to do really quick and easy simulation of the particles that are growing on top of our initial mesh. They will make that look that they are kind of breaking into small like molecules or something, I don't know. So the idea here is a simple pyrosource spread simulation, and we can go to our file cache and maybe set it to be temperature here, so it's better to visualize it. Of course, we want to disable the RBD, and we want to just the particles here. So now if I go to file cache, now we should see it. Yeah, so what I want to do here is set up a few emitters. These are my kind of not the emitters, but things that will determine which particles have that heat. And you've probably seen this from my previous tutorials. It's easy to set up thing, which consists from the main geometry, the groups. Groups are this one is called heat, and bounding type set to bounding object, group type points. Bounding object is these spheres. You can see here where they are. I don't want them to be kind of visible from the start, right? So yeah, I set it up, set the angle of the camera, for example, this camera 1. We don't actually see these groups before they actually spread. I set this attribute create for the group heat. Name is temperature, value set to 100. Pyrosource spread then does its job and spreads it across the geometry. What I want to do with this pyrosource spread is I am animating the rate. I'm decreasing the rate from the frame 100 till the last frame. I'm decreasing that rate because I want the pyrosource spread to be kinda aligned with the pieces that are being disconnected. I don't want it to be faster than the pieces that are disconnected. For example, at the frame 90 or 100. And this is working with our retimed simulations, right? We don't want to retime this. This has already that retime node enabled. So that's why we are working not with 90 frames now, we are working with 270. And also because after enabling our retime node, we don't have anything at the frame from the 1 till the frame 60. We can also skip that and render from the frame 60 now. So yeah, here you can see how that spread going, and I don't want it to be at the frame 120. I don't want it to be already here, right? I want it to be kinda aligned in a speed with the actual RBD simulation. So then we have our group burned, and group burned is just a group that targets all the points that are already burned, that have attribute burn more than 0.1. Then I add the color, and to see the color we go to the pyrosource spread and set the visualize to none, and I add the color data here to be constant black, and then I add the color red to the burned group. Then I subdivide it all, and I don't actually kind of need to fix the geometry because we are not using geometry, we are using just the points. And if we bypass this thicken right now and we go here where I delete everything but not the points, I set it to be key points, pattern is set to this asterisk sign, and then maybe let's skip the coloring. Just for now, let's skip the coloring. So here are our points, but the main thing is that for now you won't be able to see them because they are so much like on that geometry that the radius of the particles that we are rendering, it will be so small that it will be kind of in the geometry, it won't be visible. That's why we have this lapse thicken node, which makes our mesh, which is here, it makes it a bit more thicker. And if we go here and I enable that thicken, you can see it gets a tiny bit more thick. And this is just because we want our particles kind of on top of our main geometry. We don't want it to be inside or very much aligned, and that's because our particles will also be so small. Yeah, that's why we want to make our initial geometry a bit more thick. In both directions, of course. Let me just enable the color data back here and here. So yeah, then we delete, again, I said it, delete everything, but leave the points. For this attribute triangle, I just manipulated the p-scale a bit and created this visibility attribute, which is the CDR. Then I added a bit of point jitter because I wanted it to be a bit chaotic. And then we have our color, which is bind to the visibility, which is bind to our red channel. And this remapping from the black and red and black and white is just because I also want to control the opacity of these points with the redshift materials. And I will bind this visibility parameter to the actual shader opacity. Let me scroll to, I don't know, maybe frame, yeah, this frame 90. After we set up our visibility to be from 0 to 1 and from the black to white, we want to add the attribute blur because I really want to go and make that smooth fade in the opacity. And here you can see how smooth it gets. It doesn't get that smooth because we actually have decreased we are decreasing our power source spread with time. But for example, at frame 150, you should see a pretty good gradient here in the attribute blur. Blurring duration set to 100. Attributes, of course, color data, pin border points unchecked, influence type proximity. Yeah, that's it. Those are our particles. And if we now at the frame 151 combine our RBD, our particles, our dust, and our smoke, it doesn't look good at all, right? And now we will be setting up our materials. Of course, we also have our background plane, which yeah, is just like a grid with a UV project. Nothing crazy here. But yeah, let's talk about the materials because it's super important here. It's basically without proper setup of the materials, it will look absolutely disgusting and ugly. So let me just enable the RS vertical view here. Let's fire up the render. Let's maybe remove the smoke just for now because it will be making our setup, our rendering heavier, and we don't need that. We will be actually like talking about what's going on here in that render viewport, and we want to see it all really fast. Right, so our RBD setup, what do we have here? Of course, we have a ton of motion blur here in the redshift OBJ. You want to enable transformations motion blur, enable mesh deformations motion blur, enable instance particles motion blur, mesh deformations blur from velocity attribute. You want to enable all of that so you have your nicely set motion blur. Of course, we will be setting it in the redshift drop, but for now, just make sure that you enable all of these. For the render, oh, actually, no, I'm wrong. I was setting that all to the background, and we actually don't need that to be on the background. We have set it up properly here for our RBD. So in the render, you can see that I'm creating, I have actually created that material that is called watch. Let me arrange that nicely and go to our material network. So here we have our watch material. We are referencing a bunch of different stuff here. So of course, for this texture, I'm using just two noises, one for the roughness, one for the bump. You cannot actually see it right now, but I think on the preview in the beginning of this tutorial, you saw maybe just a very tiny bumps on the surface of that watch. And for this attribute, particle attribute lookup, we have our color data, right? From 0 to 1 or from black to white. And we again drop that particle attribute lookup here, attribute name CD, and out color goes into the materials overall opacity here. And that's how we can hide. I don't know if you will be able to see it, but you can see it in the animation that some of these chunks actually are like semi-transparent or something. I don't actually know. Yeah, if you will. Oh yeah, you can see it here. Of course, there's a lot of motion blur, but you can actually see it here. For the dust and for the particles, absolutely that same thing. Our dust particles are a bit more reflective. Our particles that are covering the RBD with the growth, yeah, they are not reflective. They are absolutely rough. So in both cases, I'm using particle attribute lookup with the attribute name CD, and yeah, I'm hooking that to that overall opacity. Let me show you, for the particles it will be the same that with the RBD, but yeah, let's enable it anyway. Here you can see that slight change in the opacity here. So yeah, that's how they look. For the dust, of course, should be that same change in the opacity. I'm not sure if you're able to check it now because it's so so noisy. For the particles, again, for our dust and our particles, of course, render objects as particles should be checked. For the settings, for these particles that are growing on that surface, I disabled the motion blur. For the dust particles, of course, I have enabled motion blur. And for the smoke, which will be one of the most interesting parts of this project, again, here's my really dense smoke, and I want it to be like that. I don't want it to be like a, I know, electronic cigarette smoke, right? So for this one, what I did was actually going here, drop a volume and drop the smoke material, and the smoke material is of course linked to our smoke. So in the volume here, if I set this absorption coefficient to 1 and density to 1, we will see in a moment when it will process this. This is your initial smoke, and it's not that dense, it's boring, right? If we start bumping up this absorption coefficient to be like 3, for example, it will be getting more and more dark because it is not transmitting that much light through it. And if we bump it up to like 8, like it was in my case, it will be extremely dark. And of course we don't want it. We want it still to be super dense, right? But we also want the light to be able to kind of shine on it or shine through it. No, don't shine through it, actually. I'm very bad at physics, actually. But yeah, I found that bumping the scatter coefficient to something like 10 actually gives me that result that I really want. And this is that thick, very thick, but still bright smoke. So yeah, I think that's it for the background. Of course, it's just like a rough single color plane. So yeah, that's how I basically built this setup. Let me just enable the RBD now, and this setup is super heavy to render. Maybe if you have like two 3090s, it will be nothing for you, but yeah, Macs are still not optimized for rendering, and notebooks in general or laptops are not optimized for rendering. So that's why let me switch back to the vertical layouts, and I should be able to scrub through and show you the cameras. Of course, I added the bokeh and I keyframed the focus distance and keyframed the translations and rotations. So if I just scrub through it and of course select the cam 1. So this is my camera 1 and this is the close-up camera 2. So yeah, for the rendering, we go out, redshift ROP. Render frame range should be set from 60 to 270. For the output, rendering PNGs. For the redshift settings, I'm using this unifying sampling, minimum samples 128, max samples 1400, 512 for the reflection samples, 1024 for the light and volume samples, and of course motion blur. So here you want to enable transformation and instances steps. For my case, it's just 3, and 3 works for most cases. Deformation blur should be checked, instances particle blur should be checked, deformation particle steps should be also like 3 or something, and the shutter, the more the bigger the difference between the start and end, the bigger the motion blur you will have. And because we have scaled the velocities by 10 times, you don't actually want to go with a start being 0.1 and end being 0.9 for this case. It will give you like extreme motion blur. For the global illumination, trace depths set to 8 and secondary brute force rays are set to 1024. both GI engines are using brute force. And yeah, I think that's it for that project. I think this setup is so versatile, and you maybe don't need to even use like all of these kind of setups combined. I mean, smokes, particles, dust, and the RBD. Maybe you just want to use smoke simulations or just these growing particles. I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and learned new tricks, and I will be back really soon. Bye!